Hello, my name is Bill Dixon. Welcome to the Lessons of Vietnam, North Carolina Vietnam Veterans Incorporated. And I have my co-host back tonight. He's got his mouth reasonably well okay, Mr. Bob Matthews. And he had some oral surgery and was under the weather for a while.
We call it cosmetic surgery. Thank you very much.
We have a show tonight is coming up with an anniversary. It's not an anniversary that you celebrate. It's anniversary of Infamy, as far as I'm concerned. We talked about the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor was the day of infamy. Well, so was 40 years ago, April 30th, 1975, a day of infamy. That was the day that the communists burst through the gates of Saigon, and Saigon fell, and the communists took over South Vietnam. Bob, we were just talking about it before. Where were you, and what were you doing when the Saigon fell?
You know, it's hard to go back, but I knew we were doing the show tonight, and I asked that question to like 5 people today. I had lunch with a friend of mine who's a Vietnam veteran. We were talking about when Saigon fell. I was living in Meadville, Pennsylvania, coaching baseball, teaching school, and it was a big deal. It was one of those things that came and went, and you never thought about it because there was no one to talk to. Most of the people I knew had no Vietnam connection except my family, of course. And when Saigon fell, to me, it was a tragedy. And we commemorate it today to talk about it, hopefully to get the facts in a row and get things straight for the Vietnamese and for the Americans to serve there. But Bill, remember when it fell, we had been home 7 years. Where were you?
Well, I was on a construction site working, and sad to say, I was somewhat like you are. Hey, it was a tragedy, and I to myself was, what a waste.
What a waste.
And it did. I guess I was self-centered or whatever at the time, because it just never struck me as to think about, well, the South Vietnamese people lost their country.
Well, you know, Bill, you look back on things now, you talk about Saigon falling. A lot of Americans that have studied Vietnam since have a false illusion that everybody that went to Vietnam went to Saigon. I never saw Saigon until we went back on our humanitarian trips. Saigon, to a lot of veterans, was a city in the distance. We never went there. There was not very much fighting in Saigon. The Viet Cong, of course, was there. We were out in the hills and the marshes.
Well, I was in Saigon quite a bit. I was stationed at Long Binh, 20 miles north of Saigon. I was in Saigon quite a bit, going through and so forth. And there was a lot of fighting, especially during Tet there. Yeah. I've got some interesting pictures that you see these blown out buildings in World War II, where it looks like during Tet. It's amazing that people always say, you know, that tornado went through, it looks just like a war zone. Well, they never ever seen what a war zone looks like, so they don't know. But I have, and Saigon during Tet. And since then, as we have said before, we have done research and reached out. Well, you know, there's a lot of American soldiers out there who went to Vietnam, did their thing, but they came home, they resent the Vietnamese, period, the entire people, North and South. They resent the South Vietnamese soldier. And don't want to have anything to do with Vietnam or anything with the people. I find that just hard to find a reasoning for that. I hear people all the time, well, they turned and ran. Well, if I remember correctly, there was quite a bit of people turned and ran during the Revolutionary War. At the Battle of Gettysburg, the Virginians were credited with going on Pickett's charge. But in reality, the people who got the farthest from Pickett charge was a group from North Carolina, and the Virginia 22nd turned and ran. So turning and running is not that necessarily always just the first time in Vietnam War. And one of the reasons the Vietnamese people or soldiers turned and ran, they had no training quite often. Okay. The guy who leading them got his job as a colonel or a general because his family had enough money to buy him a position. And that's what happened at My Lai, was they didn't have leadership, and things got out of control. And it happened the same way with some of the South Vietnamese soldiers. And those people lost their country, and a good part of it goes back to what happened after the supposedly peace with honor.
Well, Bill, you know, a lot of the Vietnam veterans that feel that way about the Vietnamese, we have spent 20 years educating people about Vietnam, about what we did, what we didn't do, what we should have done, what we might have done. And I think a lot of the American soldiers that come back didn't understand Vietnam, and it ended when they came home. For us, it never ends. We talk about Vietnam all the time. We teach it everywhere. And the fall of Saigon, to me, is a time in history where we have to pause a little bit. We have to pause and think about all parties involved, because all the vets have feelings. The Vietnamese call, you know, Black April, of course. It's not something they celebrate, but they do commemorate it. They think about it a lot, because Saigon, even though they're American citizens, and we know a lot of them, Vietnam is still their home. And it hurts when their capital city fell. There's been books written about it, movies made about it, articles, all kinds of things about the fall of Saigon. And we do welcome your calls tonight, because as you do think back in history, 40 years ago, everybody probably knows where they are. They usually use the John Kennedy assassination and even the 9/11 bombings to say, where were you on these times in history? We'll try this one on again. 40 years ago, April 30th, 1975, when all our efforts in Vietnam, Saigon fell. The wall was not built then. There was no Vietnam Wall. Watergate had happened, of course. We talked about that earlier. But it put a stamp on the war. I'm not saying it wasn't worth it, because for many, many people, it was worth it, and they would do it again. But when Saigon fell to the communists, and most of you know, because we've told you 100 times, it was part of the Cold War. It was a loss we weren't willing to take, but we had to take.
You know, Bob, we looked back as just why Saigon fell. There's not any one reason other than somewhat, there were several reasons why it fell, but the major thing, that reason Saigon fell, is because our government made a promise to the South Vietnamese people and reneged on it. There was a Congress change of parties. A lot of the people who came into office when your favorite story about Nixon and Watergate.
Yes, that's my favorite. I know.
You've always tried to get that as part of the...
and I will tonight again.
Okay. And he was in a situation, Nixon was in a situation, he resigned. The new Congress came in right after that, and they wanted to... so many of those people who came in the new Congress were former war protesters and so forth. So they came in with an opinion already, and basically what they did was take the Paris Peace Accords and throw them out the window, and everything we had promised the South Vietnamese people, they said, forget it, you ain't getting nothing. We promised them $1.5 billion of aid, bullet for bullet, helicopter for helicopter, whatever they needed, and then they turned back around and said, no, we're not giving them anything. And at the same time, Russia and China was pouring in tanks and anti-aircraft weapons and so forth to the North Vietnamese communists. We walked off, and the peace with honor situation, we actually left about 200,000 North Vietnamese inside. In fact, they were just where we just came back from this past May in the Dong Ha area.
Exactly.
I remember seeing pictures of Dong Ha that was just completely destroyed, and North Vietnamese were there.
Well, Bill, you know, the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail went from a path, a dirt road, to a 2-lane paved highway that the Russians and Chinese could go down in tanks, in 16-wheelers, 15-wheelers, 14-wheelers. We're going to call those trucks. But as we talked about it before, when we promised the South Vietnamese we would stick with them, the grand plan, as you mentioned, was to duplicate the Korean situation, to fortify the South, to put a stranglehold on communism, to fortify the DMZ, to train and stop communism and establish Vietnam as a base in Southeast Asia on a permanent basis. Keep troops there, resupply, all of this. Then, as you mentioned, with Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson, maybe two of the strongest presidents we've ever had, as far as they both had majority in both houses in Congress. they could pretty much pass any type of legislation they wanted. And I'm not going to dwell on this, but you know I love Watergate. And when Watergate came through, Nixon's stranglehold on America left. Well, his predecessor, Lyndon Johnson, quit. He wouldn't run for the second term.
Yeah.
So Nixon comes in, and the Case Church Amendment came in, and Congress then took a hard look at presidential war powers. And since that time in history, they've weakened the presidency.
Yeah. Well, Bob, back when you first started this course, Lessons of Vietnam, you put together a paper on what would have kept the United States in the war and so forth. Read that paper and let's talk about how it is today. And
I wrote this 12 years ago, and somebody asked me a question at one of our seminars: did we lose in Vietnam? And I stopped, and one of the colleagues with me, one of the veterans, walked out of the meeting. He said, "I'm never coming back if you don't answer that question." That's how I'm going to answer it. We lost on paper, but we could have won. And here's how we could have won. I sat down in Texas and wrote this. Hindsight, how we could have won in Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson, our president at the time, he knew how to win. He was tired of being a hired hand image from John Kennedy. He was picked with Kennedy, of course, to win the presidency, to carry Texas. Now he wins. He's his own man with the largest majority in the history of the United States when he won in 1964, beating Barry Goldwater. He does the following. Step one, Lyndon Johnson. Areas that are taken in Vietnam are pacified and then fortified. Remember the old build a fort and stay there? Don't run every night? Step two, the areas of real estate that are fortified are now occupied by U.S. forces and Vietnamese, who we train constantly, later called Vietnamization. Step three, the occupied forces train the people to defend themselves. They neutralize the area. They get rid of the Viet Cong. We slowly leave, but we constantly have patrols, maintain security and rapport, and we're teaching the Vietnamese at the same time English and free enterprise system. Lyndon Johnson then runs again in '68. He does not quit. He defeats Richard Nixon, which he would have. Watergate never happens. Congress doesn't pass the Case Church Amendment. We honor our promise to South Vietnam. Bullet for bullet, man for man, tank for tank. The peace talks work. We have two nations. We don't argue about the size of a table in Paris. We have North and South Vietnam to this day. The Cold War ends. We maintain a presence in Asia with bases in Vietnam. It's a long-term activity. Made a lot of sense to me 12 years ago. Where does the time go?
you know, there's a lot of basis for that sort of stuff. By the way, if you'd like to take part and you have Skype, go on to Skype. Computers 2K, that's 2K, the letter 2, K is in kilo, voice. Or 919-518-9773. And ask your questions, make your comments, disagree, whatever you want to do. Talk about the weather, or whatever you want to talk about. Bob will talk to you about some baseball or whatever.
Right.
But take part in the show. Bob, I want to read something here that was by from Prager University. I don't like to read on the air, but then again, I can't remember all this stuff. It's
there you go.
getting hold.
You can do it.
Did the United States win or lose the Vietnam War? We are taught that it was a resounding loss for America, one that proves that intervening in the affairs of other nations is usually misguided. The truth is, that's one of those myths we keep talking about. The truth is that our military won the war, but our politicians lost it. The communists in North Vietnam actually signed a peace treaty, the Paris Peace Treaty, effectively surrendering. But the United States Congress didn't hold up its end of the bargain. In late 1972, South Vietnam and the United States were winning the Vietnam War decisively by every conceivable measure. That's not just this gentleman's view. This was a view of our enemy, the North Vietnamese government officials. Victory was apparent when President Nixon ordered the United States Air Force to bomb industrial and military targets in Hanoi. That was along about the time they were going, well, let's argue about the size and the shape of the table and everything else they could do. So Nixon said, okay, you want to argue about the table? I'm going to start bombing Hanoi regularly. And they realized then that maybe they ought to go back and turn back around and come back to the peace thing. They mined Haiphong Harbor. They stopped, and then when they went back to the table, Nixon stopped the bombing like he promised. So the talks that had kind of walked off from, they went back and went back into and did some real negotiating and so forth.
Sure.
On January 23rd, 1973, President Nixon gave a speech to the nation on primetime television announcing that the Paris Peace Accords had been initialed by the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, the Viet Cong, and the accords would be signed on the 27th. Now, South Vietnam went along with the signing of the peace accords mainly because they didn't have a whole lot of choice.
Right.
They went to the party kind of screaming and dragging their feet. What the United States and South Vietnam received in those accords was victory. At the White House, it was called VV Day, Victory in Vietnam Day. The U.S. backed up that victory with a simple pledge within peace accords saying, should the South require any military hardware to defend itself against any North Vietnamese aggression, we provide replacement aid to the South on a piece-by-piece, one-to-one replacement. The advance of communist tyranny had been halted on those accords. And actually, right after Ford came in is when, and after Watergate is when the North Vietnamese decided to fill out, try and see just what they could get away with. They attacked a major province north of Saigon.
They did.
And won that. The United States sit there and said, okay. And they took that, and then basically after that, most of the fighting up for a year or so that South Vietnamese did, they won pretty decisively.
Every battle.
Even though that Russia and China and Cuba were all furnishing tanks and weapons and anti-aircraft gun to the North Vietnamese, and we were giving nothing to the South Vietnamese. You mentioned a while ago the Cooper Church and the Cooper Chase. Tell us about those, if you would,
Okay. There were two amendments. Frank Church was a well-known senator, as well as Fulbright from Arkansas, and these men were trying to get to erode the War Powers Act of the U.S. president. And they tried to have a couple amendments that would severely limit bombing outside of Vietnam, which almost passed, but didn't quite pass. And so it had some limitations. So we did stop bombing for a while, as you mentioned. That didn't have enough sales. They came back later with new elections, and they brought up the Case Church Amendment, which severely limited all activities in Vietnam. It really took everything Ford and Nixon said and threw it in the wastebasket. They said, we're going to tell South Vietnam one thing and do another. And one of the myths that was exposed, and a lot of Americans believed for decades, is the South Vietnamese were poor soldiers. That could not be farther from the truth. The South Vietnamese, I can say to this day, 50 years later, I am proud to have served with them. They fought hard for their country. We went to help them get their freedom. These people helped us over 200 years ago get our freedom here. We were in the right place at the right time. Congress stepped in and eroded two very strong presidents. We know Watergate was involved also. But more than that, more than Watergate, was the fact that America did not keep their word. And to this day, some people have asked me, the Bridgeback Foundation, NCBVI, why do we continue to go back to Vietnam and teach Vietnam to the nation? We're trying to get it right. We walked away from those people, and we left them hanging there and didn't do anything to police people who broke a written agreement. They broke a written contract. And what happens because of it? Henry Kissinger gets a Nobel Peace Prize in a new suit.
For basically selling out the American people. Going right along with Bob said, let me continue reading this here. Here we are. We were winning the war. We forced the communists to go to the peace table and really negotiate instead of arguing about the size and shape of the table.
Correct.
We had a peace agreement. may not have been the best peace agreement when you leave 200,000 of the communists inside South Vietnam. But had we been able to continue with the promises we had done to the South Vietnamese people and to South Vietnamese government, things would have been different, because it all came apart. And the reason it came apart is this. In August of the following year, 1974, President Nixon resigned his office as a result of what became known as Watergate. 3 months after his resignation came the November congressional election, and with them and I'm going to leave out the party because I don't want to get too political here, but a new party came into Congress into effect.
The majority.
They won by a landslide of victory for the new Congress, and many of the members, they used their new majority to fund the military aid the United States had promised, peaceful peace, breaking the commitment we made to South Vietnam. In Paris to provide whatever military hardware the South Vietnamese needed in case of the aggression from the North. Put simply and accurately, a majority of this party, of the 94th Congress, did not keep the word of the United States. On April 10th of 1975, President Gerald Ford appealed directly to those members of Congress in an evening joint session televised to the nation. In that speech, he literally begged Congress to keep the word of the United States. But as President Ford delivered his speech, many of the members of Congress walked out on the chamber. Many of them had an investment in America's failure in Vietnam. They had participated in demonstrations against the war for many years. They just wouldn't give the aid. On April 30th, South Vietnam surrendered and re-education camps were constructed, and the phenomenon of the boat people began. If South Vietnam had received the arms that the United States promised them, the results have been different. I really honestly believe they would have been different. It may be an uneasy truce, somewhat like we have in Korea today, but there would be a free Vietnam as well as the communist Vietnam. It would still have been two countries.
Well, Bill, there's one thing about we have to give hindsight a little bit of credit here. It's easier with hindsight to say what might have happened. But with Korea, the reason it's an uneasy peace and it's safe is we're still there.
Yeah.
We have 25,000 troops in South Korea. We're on hand. And if we would have kept our word in South Vietnam to them, we'd still be there. It would be a duty station in South Vietnam.
Well, you mentioned a while ago Arkansas Senator William Fulbright.
I did.
Well, here's what William Fulbright had to say about the Fall of Saigon. He was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, made a public statement about the surrender of South Vietnam. He said this: "I am no more distressed than I would be about Arkansas losing a football game to Texas. The United States knew that North Vietnam would violate the accords, and so we planned for it. What we did not know was that our own Congress would violate the accords and violate them of all things on behalf of the North Vietnamese." That's what happened.
Now, how could a man like Fulbright, who's a respected, great senator, Fulbright scholarships, all kinds of accolades, look at the wall in D.C. and say that?
Well,
and I've said him about as much as a football game. When there's 58,000 Americans gave a year of their life, or more of that, for South Vietnam. Yeah. To say something as cavalier as that makes me angry. In fact, the more I think about it, you opened the show tonight and said to me, "Where were you 40 years ago?" Well, I know where I am now. And now I'm angry.
Yeah. It's kind of hard for other countries to be allies with the United States if you realize that, in fact, I think some Republican senators just wrote a letter to ISIS and some of those guys saying, after Congress, with the next election and Congress changes, that all these things we have been talking about now and all these gains you have been doing, they're going to be changed. Kind of letting that know that just because you make an accord or an agreement with Congress today doesn't mean that's going to be that Congress a year from now.
It's true.
And that, unfortunately, is one of the weaknesses, I think, of our government, is we make commitments to other countries, and then they can come back along with another group of people, leaders, and change with a clear conscience. Well, I don't know what's a clear conscience or not, but to me, I don't see how they could have a clear conscience to throw away a country and the people of that country as the Congress did.
Well, what bothers me too is that you rarely negotiate with your enemy out of weakness. We brought to the Paris peace talks at that table the National Liberation Front. Now, who would bring the Viet Cong to a peace table? If you recognize your enemy, then they got one step on you. You don't negotiate with your enemy. You dictate to them.
Well, you know, the thing about the Viet Cong were basically those were nationalists, and after the war, after Saigon fell and the communists took over, they took a lot of those Viet Cong and put them in re-education camps right along beside the South Vietnamese soldiers, because they didn't want them to be nationalists; they wanted them to be communists. So they put them in a re-education camp to get them thinking about. So taking them to Congress was, taking them to the Paris Peace Talks was just a ploy to a certain extent of save face and the political games they play.
If you have an opinion on the subject tonight, the fall of Saigon, where were you 40 years ago? As you well know, the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam conflict is being celebrated throughout the nation in many, many ways. Seminars, talk-ins, sit-downs, plays, all kinds of things. We're doing more and more in education every year. Give us a call tonight. We'd love to hear your opinion at 919-518-9773. The subject again, the fall of Saigon. A bitter day in American history.
Well, you know, another story, Bob, was along with the tragedy of Saigon falling. Before that, we were trying to get a lot of the Amerasian children out of Vietnam.
Oh, yes.
And we had Operation Baby Lift.
Sure.
And unfortunately, right after it took off, the compartment door blew off.
Yeah.
And they turned around. They were about 18 miles out of Tan Son Nhut Air Base or Saigon. And they turned around and tried to head back and got within 2 miles of the airport when the plane crashed. And of the plane crash, 11 of the 29 crew members were killed and 144 passengers and children were killed in that crash. A few people walked away. But you know, Captain Mary Clinker.
Oh, yes.
Mary was the last soldier to die, she was the last officer to die in Vietnam. She was also the first female Air Force officer to die in Vietnam, and she's on the wall.
She certainly is. And, one of 8 on the wall.
Yeah.
One of 8
but
women.
she was killed in Operation Baby Lift. They continued on doing that, even though the Vietnamese government did not want that to happen either, because they were losing face that we were taking their children out of the country. But we were basically taking most of the orphans who were Amerasian, of American soldiers and Vietnamese ladies out of the country for their protection and so forth, because they knew what was going to happen when the Congress took over. So Operation Baby Lift. And then there was another operation that when you watching this, do some research, go back in, look up Operation Baby Lift on Google or whatever. But also there was an Operation Frequent Wind.
Oh, yes.
That was the code name for the evacuation of Saigon. They were trying to evacuate Saigon without anybody knowing about the evacuation of Saigon, which is kind of hard to do.
Well, they even had a code song.
Yeah. When there was time for the Americans to get to the embassy, they waited to the last minute. The ambassador, the United States ambassador in Vietnam, was kind of a hands-on guy.
He was.
When they first were starting to get the dependents and South Vietnamese people out, they were taking them by bus over to Tan Son Nhut Air Base, and the government of South Vietnam was trying to stop that because they were afraid it would start a panic or whatever you want to call it. So they kind of blocked the gates, but the Americans kind of went around it and were sending them out. But then later, when just before Saigon fell, rockets and so forth blew the runway up, so you couldn't have more single-wing, fixed-wing airplanes landed. and he actually wouldn't take it for the people's word for it. He actually got in a car and went to Tonsanut to look at it for himself.
Yes, he did.
And then he he made a statement about a year before that he just could not see South Vietnamese falling to the communists. There was no way. He lost his son during the Vietnam War in Vietnam.
Yes, he did.
And I think he was just emotionally, physically spent, and he just waited too long. When it got to the end, it was almost a panic, with thousands of people trying to get in.
You know, Bill, it seems like when push came to shove, and they were playing White Christmas, our leadership did not quite stand up to the plate. It seemed like a lot of our leadership was indecisive, panicked, jumped the gun, and perhaps you can't override the president, but you can do many, many things in the heat of battle that we didn't do.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's just like we were talking about earlier. When it come time to leave, there were, and the famous picture, another myth, the famous picture of the helicopters landing on the embassy, that goes back to how the enemy, the communists, went in and captured the embassy during Tet, which is another myth. The communists blew a hole in the wall of the fence, but never actually went into the embassy itself.
Never got into
the chancery. And you see this famous picture of the helicopter, supposedly, with all these refugees panicking, trying to get on the helicopters and so forth. It was actually inside the embassy grounds, but it wasn't an embassy building. It was an apartment kind of next door. And Ford allowed 19 helicopters to go in and get the Vietnamese and Americans out. But at the end, there was 480 South Vietnamese people inside the embassy grounds when the last helicopter left. They were told by the American personnel there, even though they knew that it was the 19th helicopter was the last helicopter, that they only needed 6 more helicopters. They actually told those people they'll be sending more helicopters. They lied to them and went and got on the helicopter and left. Now, somewhere about along the line, somebody should have taken upon themselves to go, it only takes 6 more helicopters to get out those 480 people. But Gerald Ford had already decided that it was 19 helicopters all going to be there, and then he went to play golf. And they didn't want to disturb him on the golf course, I guess. So at the end, those 480 people, some of them were, a couple of them were Korean CIA agents who were executed shortly after Saigon fell. There was a couple of French embassy people. They weren't all South Vietnamese, but those were people who we had promised to look after because they had worked for our government and looked after our people. And those 480 people were just told a lie and left, and 6 more helicopters.
Poor intel. Poor intel.
Well, you know, you had the president and his staff and everything making decisions, kind of like the entire Vietnam War. You had Washington making decisions, and who do not on site and don't know what's going on. Sure. You had the people in Vietnam, and in this case, you had the admirals out on the ocean on their ships out there, and everything was trying to go through them. So things were getting convoluted with information and so forth, and the right information wasn't necessarily going out or so forth. And you see those famous helicopters being pushed off the boats and so forth.
Into the ocean, right?
Yeah. Well, you know, Amnon brought out something. I'm going to let you have it. Amnon brought out something a while ago. Here they are pushing the helicopters off the aircraft carriers because they don't have enough room for all the helicopters where the South Vietnamese military is flying out to. Why couldn't some of those helicopters turn back around and went and got those 480 people that were left? Nobody would make that decision.
Right.
I guess they were worried about their careers more than were the people.
Well, some of the questions you just can't answer. And you start thinking about, like you said, leadership. We have had the opportunity over the years to interview some of the main players in this Vietnam year, the years of Vietnam, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And one was in Charleston, a man named William Westmoreland, who was very opinionated about Vietnam and was really, I think, it made and ruined his career at the same time. The commander-in-chief vilified after the war, even had to sue CBS to kind of clear his name up a little bit. He sat for an interview with me in Charleston, and the same questions Bill was bringing up tonight, I asked him in his living room. And he looked and he goes like this. Well, Bob, you're Mr. Matthews? I said, you can call me Bob. He said, politicians will lose every war. Boots on the ground will win it. The wrong people were making the wrong decisions. And that echoes loud and clear what you just said. And another factor, Bill, we must consider too, is the people you mentioned that got out of Saigon, got out of Vietnam in the refugee program, and now are U.S. citizens, have never forgot their country.
No.
They go back, they send money back. In fact, I just finished a book, and I'm going to recommend this book on the air. I like to do this. I know you love to read out there. This book is entitled Where the Wind Leads, and it's by Mr. Tim Downs, who is a Cary resident. Mr. Tim Downs. And this man, Ben Chung, is now an optometrist in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I talked to him yesterday on the phone. We've emailed back and forth. He is a boat person who now sends over $100,000 back to Vietnam every year, helping orphans, helping orphanages, building highways, and building the country back up so it can be a player in the world. The South Vietnamese will never forget their nation. They're here now. They go back a lot. Some eventually will move back to Vietnam when the gates of Saigon open back up. And I'm a firm believer they will.
You know, along with the United States Congress backing out on the Vietnamese people, the Prime Minister of Vietnam was scared of a coup. That's how he got in position. So he pulled all the crack soldiers back and basically turned over the Central Highlands and northern part of South Vietnam to the communists to protect himself. And then he left Vietnam about 3 days before the Saigon fell. But he was so scared that he brought everybody back to take care of him in Saigon area, which was one of the weaknesses that the poor soldier in the South Vietnamese military had to put up with. Sure. Was the corruption and the self-serving part of some of their leaders and so forth, or who were not leaders. And some of these Vietnamese that in the office there came away as very wealthy people.
Yes, they did.
In the process.
All moved to France. Yep. Well, Bill, if you take what you just said and apply your geographical skills, and if you take the highlands of Vietnam, the Pleikus, Kon Tum province where I was, and you leave that to North Vietnamese regulars, you're establishing there a platform to get organized to swoop down on undefended Saigon. And it's like a sitting duck. They knew it was coming. In the book I recommended, Where the Wind Leads, they knew it was coming. They didn't know what to do. Because remember, the Vietnamese people had been through the Japanese, the Chinese, the French, the Russians, all these kinds of people in Vietnam, and they have stayed strong and prospered. And even to this day, we've mentioned it many times, we've been back to Vietnam. We are amazed at their resiliency in South Vietnam, how they become a world player. You go almost anywhere in the United States today, and you buy something like a shirt, like this shirt, or even a chair or a pair of shoes, look at the tag, made in Vietnam. They're a player. They've come back very strong with the free enterprise system. And as much as we want to say Vietnam is one of the nations in the world that is communistic, that is, in my mind, a paper tiger.
Well, South Vietnam is definitely communist, but if you go there as a tourist or visitor, everything looks wonderful on the surface. But under the surface, there's a lot of strong communism. You say too much, you disappear, and so forth.
Sure,
but how did we get to this point to start with? It goes back somewhat to the Tet Offensive, and I want to read a quote here from a news reporter who was in Saigon, one of the last to get on the helicopter, and he says here, conventional wisdom was that journalist wisdom that permitted certain people to say anything they wanted about Vietnam. And it persists to this day. Errors in fact were accepted. You can refer to the embassy compound as those as gold-plated. Use the phrase ology, and they used to describe, well, I consider that slipshod and slapdash reporting. I'm not certain what slapdash is, but I don't think it's good.
Slipshod.
The press was generally guilty of a vast amount of that. But the other part of the trial was a trail of disgust. And it talks about how Morris Safer is not one of his heroes.
Right.
Walter Cronkite, or as I call him, Concrete, was not one of his heroes. When Cronkite broadcast that famous broadcast from Hanoi during Tet Offensive, he was up on the 4th floor of a building there.
It was staged.
And he was standing there reporting with his helmet on, and there was shelling of a ridge line behind him. Well, that shelling of the ridge line behind him was pre-set up. This was his famous trip when he supposedly changed his mind and decided that we were losing the war.
Yes.
And this reporter says baloney. He'd made up his mind before we ever came out there. But the Marine staged a shelling at 4 in the afternoon, and he was on top of the mission building in Wade doing his stand-up wearing a bulletproof vest and a tin pot. And this reporter says, I was up there too, but I was doing my laundry. It was a show that he put in place. He got the Marines to attack that ridge line so it would be a good backdrop for his reporting and so forth. So basically, Concrete was reporting a lie right there, and that whole thing's changed the American public. The silent majority. You always had the protesters, but that changed the silent majority's entire thinking of the war. And
I've not heard that term in years. The silent majority.
Yeah.
That sounds like the prose of the late great Harry Summers. Am I correct?
Actually, that was a reporter. Harry Summers wasn't that exactly. He was much more critical of the whole group than any of them. Harry didn't mince words at all. He was. I never had a chance to meet him. I would have loved to have met this man. He was quite a soldier in his own right. I'm surprised he made it to colonel. He would never had a chance to make general because he had a tendency to tell people what he thought was what he thought and didn't care who he told.
I had a chance a few years ago to converse with Harry because he knew of the work we've been doing in the education circles, and he started the Vietnam magazine.
He did.
And a lot of the Vietnam magazine is it's international now, and his views are really well thought of. Harry was not only mad, Harry was informed, and that's an ally. Someone that's angry with facts, not opinion. He had some facts. When he talked, you listened. When he talked about a myth, he destroyed the myth. I could listen to Harry all day, and we've had a chance to be at a couple of the think tanks in America, Texas Tech University, the New Jersey Vietnam Museum, the Boston Symposium, where a lot of these scholars look at Vietnam through a microscope, and they attack a piece of Vietnam, and they talk to people, and they put together what's called a qualified opinion of the Vietnam experience, which we call it now. And when we go out to speak now, we are entitling our show The Vietnam Experience and allowing people to ask questions. Well, one question will be, Saigon fell. Why? We hope tonight we are shedding some light on that question. Why Saigon fell, why we kind of look the other way. Maybe we're sorry, maybe we're not. The silent majority, Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, Lee Ducteau, Paris peace talks. We must be stirring up some old memories. And when Bill opened the show tonight, where were you 40 years ago? I'll ask you the same question. Where were you 40 years ago? And you know, all the vets I've talked to, Bill, as angry as they were, the more informed they get as they get older, they get angrier.
Yeah. You know, not only that you look at those 58,000 some names on the wall, and in my own opinion, our own government, United States Congress, spit on those men that are on the wall. That's a tragedy. They're the Congress is the one that sent those men over there to do what they asked them to do. They did a great job. They gave everything they had, and then Congress just turns back around and spits on them. You know, to give you an example here, the Soviets were supplying T-54 tanks, artillery pieces, and South Vietnamese were fighting in January of 1975. The communists, with the support, as I mentioned a while ago, the Russians, the Chinese, and the Cubans were there.
Cubans were there. That's something people don't think about.
As they were moving down, of the 5,400 Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnamese soldiers who were fighting to this last battle, there were 5,400 soldiers. 850 of them survived that battle. 30,000 of the people who lived in the village and around that area were killed. Excuse me, there were 30,000 people who lived in that area, civilians and their families and so forth, and 3,000 civilians were killed by the communists as they were coming in to take over. And as we listened to the colonel the other night talk about, who was at a machine gun when Saigon fell, how he spent 8 years, and how you just cannot believe anything the communists say and do. They were saying that they were against torture. In fact, they would act against torture, but it was hard to tell the people who were of South Vietnam who went in and were tortured and put in the re-education slave labor camps that the North Vietnamese communists didn't like torture.
Well, a couple of things to chew on, Bill. As we live in the age of the internet and information, everything now is declassified. The newest thing to come out now is the top negotiators and the top, I guess you'll say, people that get information, interrogators, the word I want. The top interrogators in North Vietnam spoke Spanish. That'll turn your head, won't it? The top negotiating teams were from Cuba. And the head guy in North Vietnam is now the Minister of Education in Havana, Cuba. And the other night, Friday night, we had the seminar downtown. We had 3 POWs that gave a viewpoint of this time in history that none of us can emulate. All we can do is listen. Well, this one man, his name is Bill Schutte, and Amnon's had him and his wife on the show before, but his name is spelled T-S-C-H-U-D-Y. Now chew on this for a minute. A man named Bill Schutte, an aviator, shot down in 1965 over Vietnam, with his name on his helmet, Schutte. How would that helmet end up in a museum in Moscow? So don't tell me Russia wasn't involved. They were picking booty off bodies. They were in North Vietnam. I mean, Rambo movies or not, they were there. And so were the Cubans. That would turn your head, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
The guy in North Vietnam speaking Spanish.
Well, some of the interrogators at the POW camps were Cuban.
Yes, they were.
And you asked me a while ago about Harry Summers. Let me read just what Harry Summers had to say about the helicopters here.
Okay.
Well, first of all, he was when they knew that Saigon was going to basically fall, the United States sent a congregation over to North Vietnam to talk with about the Americans possibly staying in South Vietnam, even after the fall.
Right.
And he said, this is what Harry Summers says here. I said to Colonel 2, my NVA counterpart, you know, you never beat us on the battlefield. And Colonel 2 says, that may be so, but it's all irrelevant. It didn't make any difference the way we won on the battlefield. We lost in politics. This is what Harry Summers had to say, Colonel Harry Summers had to say about that last 6 helicopters. I've since often wondered what would have happened if President Ford, then reportedly busy playing golf in a tournament in California, had done just that. But like Pontius Pilate, both he and the Congress had washed their hands of Vietnam. Like I said, Harry Summers never pulled any punches when it's putting President Ford in the same with Pontius Pilate. Kind of gives you the idea that how he felt about the situation and so forth.
Well, as our audience is reflecting tonight, they probably always remember when Gerald Ford was installed as president after Richard Nixon's resignation. He was a lame duck from day one.
Yeah.
A lame duck from day one. Vice president ran for election. Jimmy Carter beat him. I think the dog catcher could have been Gerald Ford that year. He was out of gas, and he came in. He tried to pick up the pace. I will give Gerald credit. He tried. He tried.
Well, you know, along with, even though Congress did that terrible thing and betrayed the South Vietnamese, excuse me.
Bless you.
My nose was trying to run away. I have an athletic nose tonight. It's running. Gerald Ford, even though Gerald Ford was president and had nothing to do with Congress cutting off the aid to Vietnam, he was still basically known as the president who lost the war in Vietnam. And then he turned back around and had my favorite word, the Mayaquez incident on top of that, where we lost a lot of Marines going in for that. So Vietnam, even though Vietnam War was winding down when he took over, the legacy of the Vietnam War and the aftermaths hit him hard too, along with the letting some of the protesters or the ones who deserted and left the country come back.
Well, you know, there was a big debate about that I had with several of the veterans about the presidents that pardoned the draft evaders. So to set the record straight, although Gerald Ford was a lame duck president and the amendments were passed, they never took his veto from him, you know. He could have vetoed all of them. Now, what Gerald Ford gave to this country was a conditional pardon. The men and women that left this country went to Mexico, Sweden, underground, and Canada. He gave them a conditional pardon, which simply meant this. You could come back to this country, but you needed to serve in some service your time in grade. And that was acceptable to most Americans. Because even though a lot of the veterans didn't like the guys that went to Canada, we kind of started to understand as we got older. But Jimmy Carter, the blame rests right there.
You mean the guy that gave away the Panama Canal?
The guy that gave them a blanket pardon. I know what a blanket does. It covers everything.
Yeah.
And Jimmy said, I don't care what you did or why you did it. You're forgiven. I couldn't, when he gave that pardon that day, you could knock me over with a feather. A president that went to Annapolis, served his country in the Navy, gave a blanket pardon. A veteran himself. Sometimes I just shake my head. Like now.
Yeah. Well, you know, unfortunately, other countries are also looking out, I believe, looking at the fall of Saigon and the reasons it fell and so forth, and makes it harder and harder for us to have allies who are going to back us up because they're not certain that we're going to back them up. We've been talking about tonight the Fall of Saigon, and we could do 2 or 3 shows just on the aspects of the Fall of Saigon and why the Vietnam War and so forth. But I want to give out an invitation to you. If you're in the Raleigh or Triangle area, this coming Saturday, which is April 25th,
Yep.
the Vietnamese American community will be getting together and commemorating the Fall of Saigon. It's going to be at the Marsh Creek Community Center, which is on New Hope Road. I don't know why the Marsh Creek Center is not on Marsh Creek, but it's on New Hope Road, and from 11 to 2. If you have a chance, come over and talk to some of the people who left Vietnam. Some of them left before Saigon fell. Some of them were boat people. Some of them were spent time in the re-education slave labor camps. But talk to the Vietnamese people about losing their country. They love the country they're in now. They appreciate the American soldier and what we did and so forth, but they still have the love for their country because it was their country, and it was basically they didn't lose their country. It was taken away from them by not one aspect, not just the Congress of the United States, which was, but a lot of different things. But it's still their country. Some of them will never go back, wouldn't go back because of the communists. Their total hatred for communists, but they still remember. Most of them still speak Vietnamese.
Oh, sure.
They
sure.
still have the Vietnamese culture. They eat the Vietnamese type food and so forth. And there are two things I want you to do, Bob, on the last little bit. One
Okay.
was we were talking a while ago. There's some new names going on the wall.
Oh, yes.
And also, we've been asked to go do a session with another school who the English course has been reading a book. And if you got a chance to read this book, I'm going to let Bob talk about it. Read the book. I can't think of the word. It's the name of the title of the book goes deeper than what it does.
Sure.
I'll let you tell them.
Okay. We're going down to a charter school in Chapel Hill called The Woods. We're going to do a Vietnam experience to the junior class, about 75 students, on all the aspects of Vietnam with this panel of speakers. Their main focus is this book by the famous Tim O'Brien, who is one of the most renowned authors of the Vietnam era. The title of his most famous book is called The Things They Carried. And it doesn't mean on their back, although it does. You carry a sally pack with 70 pounds, but you carry many, many things from Vietnam. And one was the theme of tonight's show. What you carry is guilt of what happened. What you carry is remorse. What you carry is longing to go back to Vietnam and maybe build a playground, Bill.
Yeah.
At an orphanage.
Well, one of the things he talks about in there is what we carried in Vietnam was we carried the thoughts of home.
Yes, sir.
We carried the news of civil rights movements, women's movements, the drug problems here as well as there. We carried a lot of things with us when we went to Vietnam. It wasn't just on our back, as you said.
Carry a lot of things
the
home,
emotions, and it's a fantastic book. It is a book of fiction, but it does definitely reach out and
it does.
and,
It does.
and especially a Vietnam vet, or if you want to understand a Vietnam vet, this book is a fantastic book to read. And we're going to be working with the students in the English class, discussing the book and so forth. And hopefully all of the guys that are going with us have read the book. And,
They all have. I
and,
gave an assignment. I have to.
Okay.
I gave an assignment.
But it's a great book. It's another great opportunity to do some research and so forth. Bob, I'm going to turn the last couple of minutes over to you to talk about the names on the wall or whatever you want to talk about.
Sure.
And by the way, we're going to be coming up pretty soon, 2 shows that do not have quite lined up yet. One of the shows is going to be the symposium we just had with the 2 POWs plus Colonel Hein Vo, who spent 8 years in re-education camp. That's going to be a very informative show. We had a full house last Friday with that show at the museum. They've asked us to come in and do more symposiums, so we'll be talking about more symposiums that come up. And also we're going to have a gentleman who's a member of our organization who went back to Vietnam to aid some former South Vietnamese soldiers and his story and what happened to him and those soldiers. So that's some shows coming up. Bob, go ahead with the last.
We have a last bit of information for you tonight. Is every year on Mother's Day, they add new names to the wall. This year they're going to add 7 more names to the wall. So go online on the wall, Vietnam Memorial, and click on new name to the wall. Will be added in 2015. There are 7. Look these up. It'll give you their bios, why they're being added. And a lot of people wonder why the wall is staggered like my hands are, with open fingers here. That's the purpose of the wall, was to add names, if ever, to put them in order when they were killed or lost their lives with their comrades. New names are going on the wall. Mother's Day 2015. We hope you enjoyed the show tonight. 40 years ago, the Fall of Saigon. Keep in touch. Have a nice evening. Thank you, Bill.
Over and out.
There you go.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. Our weekly lineup of call-in programs includes Computers 2K Now with Amnon Nissan, Health In with Debbie Bruck, Breaking Free with Marilyn Shannon, Lessons of Vietnam with NCVVI members, The Tanya Love Show, Your Healthy Pet, with Gisela DiCarlo. And if you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it at www.nissancommunications.com. Sponsored by Atomus.com, makers of quality video recorders and converters for professionals, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.